So I'm back this week with an update to my dark fiction reading, including the horror and thriller books I've been reading recently, a combination of new releases and backlist titles. And I've been really following through on what I plan to do this year, and that is to read the good stuff and to let everything else go. So while I do want to read and review as many new releases as possible, I don't want to do that and sacrifice my enjoyment of reading. So I'm allowing myself to sample things, to put things down, and to largely focus on the things I'm going to enjoy, although I definitely am going to come here when I have a strong opinion and want to share a negative review where it is relevant. But for the most part, I'm going to focus on the things I enjoy so that I have more things to share with you that I actually do recommend. If that all sounds good, let's get started. First, we have Something in the House by Daisy Pearce. This is one of my most released horror books for 2025, and so I have had a chance to read it. It follows a child psychologist who wants to get her footings in the field, and so gets an opportunity to interview and work with this young girl, I believe a 13-year-old, and so they go to her small town where she believes she is somewhat haunted by this witch or something in the walls, essentially. And you find out very quickly that the entire town is full of superstition. So there are a lot of certain rituals and beliefs that are held by the community, and so this psychologist has to work with this young woman and try to deal with the neighbors and all of that ensues. Now, this is one that I recommend to those of you that love folk horror. I really enjoy the small town that has its own way of doing things and how that applies to the horror genre. I thought the writing in this one was really nice. It's not exactly literary or purpley or anything to that degree in terms of being flowery, but it is really nice in terms of some of the word choices and phrasing. I found myself just appreciating that aspect from the beginning. I do need to mention that with a setup like this, you have a psychologist who is not really confident in their field. I think that if someone's reading this book who has that background, you could probably quite easily be very critical of this book because of the fact that I'm sure she breaks all the rules. She's trying to do her best, but it's definitely someone who is showing forms of incompetence in her role. It kind of is part of what allows for the plot. If that is something that bothers you, you may have a different opinion or enjoyment of this book than I did. But kind of looking past that, I was able to acknowledge that she was very flawed and go along with that. She is at times kind of messy in her own personal life that comes through the book. But again, I really just enjoyed the setup. I love the potential of something being possessed and playing with a haunted, maybe house in a way that didn't feel like a haunted house story to me. Needless to say, I had a really good time with this one. It was a 4-star read for me. As for if it will be an end of the year favorite, it largely depends on what comes after. If I were to make a top 10, I would put it in now. So it's just a matter of if there are 10 more books this year that come out that knock it off the list. But if you're looking for some to pick up in terms of horror new releases, this is one of my top picks so far this year. Next, let's talk about thriller new releases, starting with Cold as Hell by Kelley Armstrong. This is a book that is the third in a series known as the Haven's Rock series. It is technically a spin-off of another series, which I personally don't think is as strong, and I did start with the spin-off series, which might be sacrilegious to some, but I will stand by the fact that I think the characters and writing is much stronger at this point, and I think it's a good entry point to the world. The general synopsis of this spin-off series is that we follow a group of individuals that are living far up north. For one reason or another, they all had to leave their lives behind. They were involved in one thing or another, and this is almost an unofficial witness protection program where people have to drop their lives, leave everything behind, and go to live here. But this is not run by law officials, but rather the community themselves have taken upon them to be a safe haven for these individuals. So they have their own laws as much as you can have without a true authority. And so we follow the individuals in this community in this book, where there's a woman who is dragged off and potentially about to be assaulted. There is a lot of alarm in the community, particularly among the women, as to what is happening, because again, this is supposed to be a safe community where the only people there are supposed to be safe, and you're not supposed to be letting anyone in who is going to cause harm. So there's a lot of questions, finger pointing, etc. We follow a woman who works closely with the sheriff of this town, and together they're investigating, trying to figure it all out. There is a pregnancy angle within the story, which for someone who has a lot of trauma around labor and delivery was really hard for me to read. So keep that in mind if that is a trigger for you. But overall, I find the series really addicting and just really fast paced. I flew through this one in a single day because I needed needed to know what was going to happen next, and it was just so easy to keep reading. In terms of the series, again, I think it's best to start back at the beginning just because a lot of what I love about the series is the development and relationship between the characters. There is a little bit of romance and just a lot of interpersonal play between the characters. You have the main character and her sister, and how they interact is very much key to some of their sections. And so I found I got a lot out of it because I have spent time with these characters before. So again, start at the beginning of the spin-off series. I don't think you have to start all the way back at the original series because again, I don't think that one is quite as good as this one, which is so addicting. What is it about Kelley Armstrong? But I love her series these days. Next we have Every Fall by Angela Douglas, and this is a domestic thriller that follows a husband and wife. Particularly we have a man who is working as a cop, and his wife at the beginning of the story has one child. She ends up very quickly falling pregnant with her second, and there's a lot of conflict because at the beginning of the story there is question of the wife's safety because of his role in the police. He's getting threats, and so he tries to find a way to balance his job and the safety of his family. Through circumstances, things change, and then you deal with the family. As time progresses, you have this woman who has now had her second child dealing with postpartum depression and also dealing with the instability of her husband, who is becoming more erratic in his own behavior. And so we follow this one through. Now, this is one that I was interested from the beginning. It was easy to get into in terms of accessibility of picking it up and getting going. I liked the characters to a degree, but they did feel a little bit flat and stereotypical. And honestly, it's a book that I could have put down or kept going with. However, I looked up some reviews, and a lot of people were hinting, or at least the reviews I were reading were hinting, that this book was going to turn into a big old supernatural horror book, and it was supposedly this whole facade of being a domestic thriller and was going to go in a totally different direction. So I decided to commit to finishing it because I needed to finish it to review and comment on that fact. Now, without spoiling too much, I can say that I don't know what those reviews were thinking, or if they were perhaps reading a different version of this arc, because of the fact that I did not see those elements in this book. And what we got is a very standard story that deals again with postpartum depression and also a lot of the PTSD that can come about with working in the police field. And so you have those factors weighing on their marriage and the other external factors that are causing the degradation of their relationship. So it's heavily focused on the domestic part of the thriller. And while there is some suspense along the way, there is a little bit of action here and there. Really, it's more of the type of thriller that is about a particular social issue, like the ones I mentioned, and happens to be framed around a thriller narrative. I don't always find those ones the most interesting because I think that there are better books that dive into those topics in more nuanced ways, while this felt a little bit surface level, and it didn't again have the character depth to back up the issues and really give me that emotional pull. Needless to say, I could have probably let this one go partway through, but I'm glad I saw it through just so I could better comment again on what to expect from this book. So again, if that sounds great, definitely pick it up. I do think there's an audience. It was a book that was fine, easy to read, very fast to fly through. So again, it didn't take up a lot of my time, but overall isn't the most memorable book, the kind that is really going to stick with me and leave an impact, which is what I'm typically looking for from my fiction reads. Now let's switch over to some backlist titles, which is what I refer to any book published before 2025 at this point. And so I decided to read Exquisite Corp by Poppy Z. Brite. This is the same author who wrote Lost Souls, which was one of my favorite books from last year. So whenever that happens, when I like a book by an author, I always want to continue on because usually there's a good chance or a higher chance that I'm going to find more favorites among the same writer. And so this is one I think a lot of people are aware of, where we follow a serial killer, and there is a lot of queer representation built into all of this author's work. And so I overall enjoyed this one. If you're looking for a very intense book that is definitely going to have some dark and gruesome subject matter, if you're looking for something more messed up, this one certainly ticks those boxes, and it definitely gets advertised that way. So I appreciate the darkness to this book. What I expected from it was more of what I loved about Lost Souls, which I felt had really interesting, deep, complex characters, as well as writing that felt almost literary to me, while this one felt much more like standard serial killer genre fiction. So again, a lot I liked about it, but it didn't quite hit the same peaks. I think most people actually prefer Exquisite Corpse over Lost Souls, but I'm the opposite, just because again, I felt that that one had a stronger emotional appeal to me and really drew me in with the writing, and I just wanted to spend time with the characters. And certainly these characters, or the main character we're following, is not a likable person, and that is not a problem for me. I just found their characterization, in my mind, a lot more simple and straightforward of what you would expect from a serial killer, which didn't leave me longing and dying to know more about them, because I felt like a lot of it was given away right at the beginning. Next, let's talk about Perfume by Patrick Süskind, and this is a dark literary classic thriller where we follow a man who since birth has had this incredible sense of smell. As an adult, he has taken that ability and essentially perverted it or used it for his own desires as he's become entranced by women. This is one I've had on my radar for a really long time. When you look up messed up books, this one always comes up. When you look up classic dark fiction, again, it is really seen as this older book that really dives into the subject matter that we often associate more with modern fiction, where you have books that are going to the edge and really pushing what is acceptable to be published in a traditionally published book, which is something I always think is interesting from a publishing perspective, to really see what editors and booksellers and everyone in the industry has the appetite to push forward. And so perhaps not surprising, but I did really enjoy this one. I thought that the writing was well done, decently accessible for someone who is perhaps more familiar or drawn to more modern writing. I thought that it was easy to follow. I believe it is translated, and again, the story itself is dark and intriguing. And I really, again, appreciate a lot about this one. As for whether it would be a favorite of the year, again, it just really depends how it falls out compared to the other things that I come across. At this point, I've given it 4 stars. I actually thought it would be a 5-star, but something about my reading experience where I appreciated and liked everything about it didn't quite hit the emotional high that I was looking for that tends to allow me to give a book 5 stars on first read. Then we have The Devil of Nanking by Hayder, and this, of course, is a story told over 2 timelines, the older one being that of the massacre of Nanking, and then we also follow a woman in the more modern day of the time this book was written, and their 2 stories begin to intersect as you imagine that they do. This is one where I found the older historical experience of Nanking to be absolutely horrific, hard to read, but also very important. I don't want to say I liked those parts of the book because that's probably the wrong word to use, but instead I'll say that I really appreciated it. I was very much engrossed in it, and while it was horrifying, I also think it's important to understand the horrifying parts of history so that we don't repeat them. So I found those parts fantastic. My struggle with the book is that I didn't find the more contemporary timeline to be as interesting, and in terms of how it all tied together, I didn't really see the argument why it had to be there. I often assume with these kind of duo narrative historical books that they are trying to hook in readers that are more familiar with contemporary fiction and somewhat trick them into reading something that is more historical by having the 2 perspectives together. If this book had been entirely in the past, it definitely would have been a stronger rating for me. I think I still gave it 4 stars because those chapters were so memorable, engaging, engrossing in all the most horrible ways, but I just wish the contemporary sections didn't have to be there because they always pulled me out of the story, which is so frustrating when a book is otherwise fantastic. Highly recommend. And yes, for those of you watching this, absolutely, I'm going to be reading more by this author because a lot of you told me to check out more of their backlist. And finally, I read I Who Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Harpman, and this is a piece of what I will describe as dystopian horror where we follow a woman who is being held captive underground with these other women. There are men that are keeping them captive, but they really don't speak or interact with the women there. And so we follow this young woman who is incredibly naive, and she's aware of the fact that she does not know a lot about the world surrounding her. Not only is she stuck in this situation, but the women who perhaps do know more than her are only telling her information on a need-to-know basis. And so the start of the story really begins with her craving knowledge. Despite not necessarily needing to know certain things, she simply has the human instinct to want to understand the world around her and to experience as much as possible. And she is very frustrated, of course, by the situation where everything is so limited. And then, of course, the story goes from there, but I don't want to give away too much, instead talk about my experience. And that's the fact that I really love the parts that deal with the thirst for knowledge. I thought it was a beautiful theme, something that I love to see in fiction. Honestly, I don't think I see it that often. In terms of a dystopian, I'll say it most appeals to those that love the horrific side of dystopian stories. If you look at it from a science fiction lens, the author does not explain a lot about how the situation got to where it is, and instead it simply just exists now, and it feels much more about the human experience, more the idea or playing around with what would happen if an individual was in this state, which to me lends itself more to horror, rather than, again, exploring a situation of totalitarian government that has gotten us to this spot. So I think if you go in looking to pick this book apart, you certainly could, but I really enjoyed it. It is short and sweet, and the writing I thought was very well done. It's very literary, but still has an intriguing plot around it that I think will appeal to those that are more genre readers, as long as you go in with an open mind. Again, again, in a very few amount of pages, I thought the author wrote a really powerful, memorable story, one I'm going to be thinking about for a very long time. I'm so glad I finally got the excuse to read it. And again, I think a lot of you who are watching this, based off your taste, based off what other books you have loved that I've recommended, I think will really enjoy this one as well. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? Personally, I feel like I have a great list here, so hopefully there is something for everyone, or at least those of you that are dark fiction readers like myself. I'd love to hear from you in the comments, so do drop a note, even if you just want to say hello. I appreciate if you give this video a thumbs up. Even if you just hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. And if you haven't yet, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of dark fiction as well as some science fiction and fantasy. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.